All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our HR Service Delivery Academy session for the month of October. I'm really looking forward to today because today we're going to be covering one of our back to the basics topics of knowledge management. And I'm personally very excited about today. Knowledge management is one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I'm excited for the next 60 minutes or so. And just in case you haven't already heard my voice on another Academy session or we haven't met, my name is Allison, and I am part of the product team here at ServiceNow. I will be the host for today's session, and I'm also joined by several amazing colleagues that you can see here on the screen. So with me today, I have Dinesh, Loknath, Mike, and Rue. These are all experts in the domain of knowledge management and our platform, so they will be helping me keep an eye on any of the questions that come in from the audience. And speaking of that, just to be clear on how we will handle Q&A today, at any time if you do have a question, please post it in our Zoom Q&A panel. If you're a regular Academy member, this is probably a reminder to you. You're probably used to how this works, but if you're new, just a reminder, please do use Q&A rather than chat. This just helps us stay organized and helps us make sure that we are answering your questions in a logical order and that other users have visibility into the questions and answers that are coming in. The other note that I'll make is that we are broadcasting to YouTube today. So if you're joining us from YouTube, feel free to place that in the YouTube chat. Those questions will make their way over to us in Zoom as well. So in terms of what we'll cover today, we are going to start with an introduction to knowledge management. So we'll cover some basic information and make sure that everyone has some kind of baseline understanding of what this really means in the context of ServiceNow. Then we have some time dedicated to do a feature overview. And what I'll say about this section is that we have a lot of knowledge management features. If we went through an exhaustive list, we would be here for hours, which is exciting. We have a lot of features, and knowledge management is a very mature application on our platform. But because of that, what I've done is I have spot picked a couple of features that I want to specifically talk about today, because I think the group will find them interesting, or maybe you're not already aware of them. Then once we get through feature overview, I want to talk through some design considerations. So we get a lot of questions from our customers around things like how many knowledge bases you should have and how you should be thinking about your taxonomy and categorization. And so we want to offer some considerations for you to think through as you're making those decisions for your organization. Then once we get through all of that content in slide format, I'm going to jump into my employee instance, and I am going to bring some of this to life. So I'll go into my instance and I'll walk you through some of the things that we will be talking about in slide format. And then time permitting at the end, we also have some time to discuss Q&A. So like I mentioned before, we will be taking Q&A in written format primarily, so please submit that in the Q&A panel. But at the end, I always check in with our Q&A staff to see if we have any themes that we should be talking about. And I also have a couple of frequently asked questions that I'd like to run through. So with that, we will jump right into our introduction of knowledge management. And per the usual, where I like to start with this in our academy is by defining our topic of the month. And so what we have on the left of this slide is kind of a definition or a quote that really defines knowledge management from a broad domain perspective. And before I start talking about the quote or the definition that is on the left of the slide, just one fun fact that I like to cite is that this term and concept of knowledge management was really first coined in the late 1980s in the management consulting industry. So it has roots back to kind of that time frame. And the quote or the definition that I have here is one of the most commonly used definitions. And I won't read through it out loud, but I'll pause just for a minute and let the group kind of skim it and read it. And a couple of things I want to point out. So first off, in the first sentence, I want to draw your attention to the words identifying, capturing, evaluating, retrieving, and sharing of information. So I really like all of those words and kind of the meaning that they bring to this term of knowledge management. And in the second sentence, I want to talk through the fact that you're really looking at capturing expertise and experience from your workers that was previously uncaptured. So when you think about the meaning of this sentence, what I immediately think of is really eliminating tribal knowledge and documenting that knowledge and experiences that your workers have to make that more scalable and usable by others. So again, that's the kind of broad domain definition of knowledge management. Now, if we look over to the right of the screen, we have a ServiceNow specific definition. So specifically in ServiceNow world, we have a knowledge management application on our Now platform. And that application enables the sharing of information via what we call a knowledge base. And knowledge bases can contain articles. So those are kind of the individual artifacts that have information. And those articles provide your users with information to self-help, to troubleshoot if they're running into issues, and to also complete tasks. Knowledge management on our platform also supports processes for creating, categorizing, reviewing, and approving articles. And the thing I like to point out about that bullet on our side is that it very directly relates to that sentence one in the definition on the left. And of course, as part of our knowledge management capabilities, users can search and browse for articles as well as provide feedback. So now what I want to do is take this a step further and really think about this specifically in the context of HR service delivery and knowledge management. So when you think about it in that context, we really have two primary personas. One of those personas is the employee persona. And so if you are an employee, what knowledge means to you is that it's enabling you to self-serve. You have information that makes your life easier as an employee. And you can actually access knowledge via our mobile app or via our portal. And as an employee, you can also interact with knowledge by rating and commenting. On the flip side, if you are under that agent persona, what knowledge means to you is that you're given in-context information as you're working through cases and helping employees at the organization. And of course, this integrates with our chat capabilities and our native case capabilities to make sure it's easy for you to access that within the flow of work. The other thing that I would point out here is also as an agent, you're consuming information that's helping you as you're working through cases. But the other thing that's awesome about the agent persona and what you're able to do is you're easily able to share information with employees about knowledge. So let's say there's an article that's available to them and maybe the employee hasn't come across it. Agents can easily share those articles with employees as they're working through cases. The other really important thing to highlight about that agent persona is that you can actually typically, as an agent, create and review articles if you have the necessary roles. And so what this is unlocking is really creation of knowledge in the flow of work as a byproduct, again, of those agent interactions that they're having with your employees. Now what I want to talk through are some of the benefits of knowledge management. And again, just specifically, if we think about the benefits of knowledge management, the list is probably endless. We could talk about this for an entire hour, but if we have to really bubble it up to some of those big themes, what you're really doing with knowledge management is you're delivering better employee service and you're enabling agents to focus on higher value work. And so specifically, if we look over to the right of the screen, we have some specific information of how this is happening. So first and foremost, you are driving ease and efficiency for your employees because you're enabling them to self-help, right? You're giving them knowledge articles and you're enabling them to access those articles directly so they can, and be empowered to access that information very directly and easily. As part of that, you're also proactively deflecting cases. So again, because you're enabling employees and they're able to self-help, You're deflecting cases from ever arising because, again, that's happening at that employee self-service level. You're also fully using the expertise of your agents and allowing them to work more efficiently on more meaningful cases through all of this. Again, because you're empowering your employees to self-help, you're deflecting those repetitive cases from ever coming in. And so what that means is that the cases that are coming to your agents are really those more complex moments or those more meaningful moments where agent engagement is necessary. And through all of this, you're also reducing your response and resolution times. So that's an obvious benefit for not only your employees, your agents, but your organization as a whole in terms of time saving and on focusing on the right work. So again, this is a really big topic if we want to dive deep into the benefits, but these are some of the big ones. Now what I want to talk about is the basic architecture of knowledge. So I've used some of these terms in passing, but I want to take a moment to specifically talk about it and highlight what each of these kind of components really mean. So at the top of this diagram, we see what's called a knowledge base. And so when I was giving the definition earlier of knowledge management and our application and what it really means in the context of ServiceNow, if you remember, I used this term. And I like to use an analogy when I talk about the concept of a knowledge base. And that analogy is that a knowledge base is essentially like a library because it holds several different knowledge artifacts, which are called articles, as part of it. And so sticking with that same analogy, if we say a knowledge base is a library, I like to say that a knowledge article can be considered a book in that library, because again, those are the individual artifacts that contain that information that are, again, allowing your employees to self-help. And specifically within knowledge articles, you can also have in ServiceNow something called a knowledge block. So a knowledge block is a smaller block of content that you can be inserted into an article, and that can be targeted and tailored to a specific employee audience to make sure that you're really tailoring and personalizing those knowledge articles according to the needs of your employees. And so sticking again with that analogy, we can say a knowledge base is like a library, a knowledge article is like a book, and a knowledge block is almost like a specific chapter. Now I want to talk a little bit more about that concept of security and targeting. So this is a common question and discussion point that we get from our customers of how can I really make sure that I am securing my sensitive knowledge content and I'm targeting it to make sure that employees are seeing what is applicable to them. And so the great news here is that you have flexibility at the knowledge base, knowledge article, and knowledge block level. So at the knowledge base level, what you can do is you can secure that by HR or user criteria. And this is something that you define when you're creating your knowledge base. And just in case you're not familiar with the concept of user criteria or HR criteria, really what this is, if you think about user criteria, you're defining conditions that are evaluated against your user records. And when you're thinking about this in the context of HR criteria, it's really conditions that are defined against your HR tables or your HR data. And so again, what this is doing at the knowledge base level is it is allowing you to entirely hide or display a knowledge base based on an employee's access. Now, if we go one level deeper, we have, again, the knowledge article. And so the great thing here, again, is that you can secure knowledge articles using criteria, and you can define this when you're drafting your articles. So again, this is going a level deeper than knowledge base. And so you're hiding or displaying based on an employee's access at that article level. And then going one step deeper, again, that concept of knowledge blocks that we just talked about. As a reminder, those are those reusable blocks of content. You're also able to secure these by user or HR criteria and include this within a knowledge article. So what you're doing is hiding or displaying very specific content that's been inserted into your articles based on a specific employee's access. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about here is categorization and taxonomy. And where I'll start is with the left of the slide, and then I'll work my way over to the right. So first, let's talk about knowledge categories. So knowledge categories, of course, exist to help you drive organization amongst your articles. And this is something that you define at the knowledge base level, and it applies to your knowledge articles. So from a very, very high level technical perspective, if you're thinking about the different record types that you're working with, again, you're defining this at the knowledge base level. You have categories, and those are associated to specific knowledge articles. The other thing that I want to mention about knowledge categories is that you can establish a hierarchy, and you can do this by defining parent-child relationships. And just to bring this one to life a little bit, I like to give an example here. So let's say perhaps you have a knowledge category of benefits at your organization, and maybe within benefits, you want to have a child category of retirement benefits, health benefits, a couple of other types of benefits. that really just helps display what you can do with that hierarchy and that parent-child relationship. So those are knowledge categories. On the other side of this slide, we have content taxonomy. So this is something that is new with our release of Rome and Employee Center, and we're really excited about this. And really the purpose behind a content taxonomy is to provide your employees with an employee-facing, employee-centric topic structure, and that's driving what we call curated experiences. And essentially what that is more employee-centric ways of browsing and finding different types of content. And the awesome thing about this content taxonomy is that it's actually applying to not only knowledge articles, but also catalog items and quick links at your organization. So again, it's really this employee-facing topic structure that sits on top of your content to drive that employee-centric browse experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about this content taxonomy. We'll show it once we get into the live walkthrough, and I'll show exactly how some of this is surfacing. But for now, again, what you need to know is that this is an employee-facing topic structure that applies to not only knowledge articles, but catalog items and quick links as well. And the way this works from a high level technical perspective in terms of the types of records that you're dealing with is within your taxonomy, you would have topics, and you would actually connect content to your topics. And again, once we get into the instance walkthrough, I'll show you exactly what this looks like. And similarly, just like what we can do with categories, you can also establish a hierarchy for your content taxonomy. And this is also defined via parent-child relationships. The other thing I specifically want to highlight about the content taxonomy is the fact that we actually are delivering a sample employee taxonomy with topics and child topics out of the box, and again, released with Rome and our Employee Center portal. And the nice thing about this is that this gives you a blueprint as a customer that you can use as a starting point. And you can actually clone this taxonomy and modify it per your needs. So again, it's a nice starting point. And once we get into that live instance, I will show exactly what this looks like. All right, so next on to our feature overview. And again, one thing I'll highlight here, I highlighted this before, but we have a lot of features, so I've spot picked a couple. And what this slide is showing is essentially a bird's eye summary of some of our features across 3 different pillars. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of give a summary of the different features across these 3 different pillars. But what we'll do in a moment is for any of the items that are bolded in blue, I actually have deeper dive content. So I have slides that we'll walk through, and then we'll also look at some of this live in our instance. But the 3 pillars, as you can see, are employee, process governance, and agent and author. And I'll start on the employee experience pillar. So as we talked about before, if you are an employee, you can of course view articles in ServiceNow, and you have the flexibility to view those articles in our Employee Center portal, in our Now mobile app, and you can also access them via virtual agent. You're also able to search for knowledge articles, of course, and you're able to use Zing search or AI search to find those articles. You're also able to browse for articles, and this associates very directly back to what I was just talking about with the content taxonomy that we released. And so with that, again, there are a set of capabilities that we use the term curated experiences to describe. And we'll kind of dive into those in a couple of moments in slides. And then again, I'll show that once we get into our instance. Also under this employee experience bucket, we have recommended for use suggestions. So this is something that I'll deep dive into, but this is actually allowing you, if you are an HR service delivery professional or enterprise customer, to use a machine learning algorithm to provide recommendations for your employees. And then last but not least, as I alluded to earlier, if you're an employee, you can also offer feedback on knowledge. And I'll dive into specifically what types of feedback you can provide in a couple of moments. Now moving on to the process governance pillar here. This is really kind of the heart of knowledge management. We have a lot of features in this bucket, which is exciting because I know we have a lot of needs and kind of requirements that customers run into around governance. So I won't read through this entire list. There's a lot here, but a couple of things that I will highlight. Our platform, of course, supports the ability for you to have multiple knowledge bases. And once we get to our design considerations portion of today, what I'll walk you through are some considerations that you should be thinking through as you're thinking through the design of the knowledge bases at your organization. We also, of course, support publishing workflows. So if you have a workflow that you would like to go through and requires certain approvals before an article is published, that's, of course, something that you can do. We also support the concept of article versioning. So as you're making changes, you're creating different versions of your articles and tracking those. We also have something called an article template that you can enable. And really what this is doing is it's driving a consistency across your articles and prompting different fields to be completed. We also have knowledge blocks, as we talked about earlier. There's something called actionable feedback, and I'm going to be diving a little bit deeper into this both in slide format and in our instance. But really the thing to know about actionable feedback from this bird's eye overview is the fact that, again, as an employee, you're able to submit feedback on articles. And really what you can enable here is actionable feedback to make sure that you're doing something actionable at your organization to, take into consideration that feedback and drive change. There's also something called an article quality index that you can use to drive consistency across your knowledge base, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We also have dashboards. You can establish something called group ownership, and I'll talk a little bit more about that during some general tips that I'll share in the design considerations. You can harvest knowledge from employee forums. We offer support for really managing the translation needs of your organization as it relates to knowledge. We also have something called knowledge demand insights. And so this is something that I'll deep dive into earlier. And if I personally had to pick one of my favorite knowledge features, this is what I would pick. So I'm excited to talk about that in a couple of slides. And then of course, we also have the ability for you to essentially set article expiration dates via a valid to field. And this is again, something that I will show once we get into the instance. So again, a lot of goodness baked into that process governance bucket. Now, if we look over to the agent and author experience area, there are a lot of things that you can do across this pillar as well. So again, like we talked about earlier, if you're an agent, you can do things like contextually search for information as you're working on cases. There's something called Agent Assist that really directs you towards the applicable knowledge that you may need as you're working through a case. You can even search as an employee. So as you're working on an HR case, you can search the knowledge base as that subject person of the HR case that you're working on. You can filter knowledge to make sure that you're diving into the knowledge content and finding what you need. We also have a task integration, so you can attach an article, you can flag it, you can report a knowledge gap, and those are a couple of things that we'll talk about once we get to the live demo. Again, another big thing that I talked about earlier is that you can textually create articles within the flow of work. So again, what this is enabling is that byproduct of your interactions, really driving your knowledge content forward. And of course, we also have meta tagging. So I said it a couple of times, but I'll say it again. This list is not comprehensive, just a couple of spot pick things that I wanted to talk through. And now what we'll do is talk through in a deeper level, the items that are in blue. So first, starting with that employee experience bucket, the first thing I want to talk a little bit more about is this concept of browsing and curated experiences. So as I mentioned before, this directly correlates to that new taxonomy that I was just talking about on one of our previous slides. So essentially what curated experiences is, it's an umbrella term that we use for a set of capabilities that drive more employee-centric content discovery across our portal and the Now mobile app. And so on this page, I have a couple examples of how that comes to life that I'll walk through here. And then once we get to the demo, I'll show this in our Employee Center portal. But first, starting in the left, we have a new mega menu navigation widget. And so what this is doing is it's providing an additional option for your employees to browse your taxonomy of topics and really peruse to find the information that they may want to access. We also have this popular topics widget that you can place on your homepage. And so again, this is very directly tied to that new content taxonomy. And what we're seeing here in this popular topics widget are topics that are a part of a taxonomy. And how this is being calculated is it's looking at the content that you have to your taxonomy, and it's essentially looking at the popularity or the views of those items and using that to drive topics to be pushed to this widget as necessary. So again, the nice thing about this is that this is dynamic and it truly does update based on what's popular to your employees. The other thing that's nice about this, so let's say you're using the mega menu widget or you're using that popular topics widget and you click into one of those topics, where you're going to go is to a dynamic topic page. And I'm really excited about dynamic topic pages. Again, this is tied to that taxonomy. It's new with Realm and Employee Center. These dynamically generate based on the content, again, that you have tagged to your taxonomy. So in the middle of the slide, we have a screenshot that kind of walks through these topic pages. And at a high level, what you're seeing here is that topic page and the content that's tagged to it. So this can be, again, knowledge, it can be a quick link or a catalog item. And we'll look at this live in a while as well. And then, of course, this can be experienced from our mobile app. And so this kind of concept of a topic page is what we see on the far right of the screenshot. Next, I want to talk about the recommendations for employees. So as I was mentioning before, this is a portal widget. So we're looking at this in the context of Employee Center that can provide recommendations, which can be knowledge articles or catalog items to your employees. And again, as I mentioned, if you are an HR service delivery professional or enterprise customer, you can actually use a machine learning algorithm to drive this content. And so at a very high level, how this is working is it's looking at the logged in user, and it's looking at their profile to identify other users who are considered similar to them. And for those similar users, it's looking at their past activity and using that data to train an algorithm and then generate recommendations for the logged in employee. Next, I want to talk a little bit more about knowledge feedback. So again, specifically under this employee persona, there are a couple of different options that you have for providing feedback to articles. So what we're looking at on the left of this slide is a screenshot of an article from a portal, and I have a couple of things highlighted, and I have descriptions for those on the right of the slide. So one of the things that you can do in terms of providing feedback on a knowledge article is you can mark them as helpful and answer that as a yes or no question. And so this is something that's property driven, and again, we can see that example in the screenshot on the left. Another option that you have is you can actually provide a star rating for an article. And this is really a mechanism for employees to indicate the overall article effectiveness. And this is a 1 through 5 star rating. And again, this is also property driven. Another thing that you can do in terms of knowledge feedback as an employee is you can really enable your employees to have a conversation around a knowledge article, because they can add comments, as you can see in the screenshot, at the bottom of a knowledge article. And from a kind of configuration perspective, this is something that you can disable on a per knowledge base basis. And once we get into the instance, I'll show you how you kind of designate that. The other thing I want to specifically highlight, and I talked about this before, and we'll look at this once we get into the instance, again, is this concept of actionable feedback. So if you're collecting this feedback from employees, really it's important to do something with that feedback. And so there are some properties that you can enable to really make sure that you're generating a feedback task, and this is being considered by your knowledge team. So again, we'll look at that in a moment in a bit more detail. All right, so moving on to our next bucket of process governance. A couple of things I want to re-highlight here. So one, I want to again talk about knowledge blocks. I've talked about them a couple of different times, but this is a really big feature that I want to make sure everyone is aware of. So again, just as a refresher, knowledge blocks are those reusable pieces of content that you can add to your knowledge articles. And again, really this allows you flexibility in controlling which employees can read or not read the block content. And as we can see here in this screenshot, we have 2 blocks that have been inserted into this example article. So one is for employees or individual contributors, and one is for people who are managers or people who are managing teams. And the reason these are inserted as blocks is because this text varies based on that kind of information about the employee. So again, the really big benefit here that you can see with knowledge blocks is that you have one source of truth, but you can insert different blocks that are appearing for different groups of your employees. The next thing I want to talk about in this process governance bucket is that concept of article quality. And so we have something called an article quality index that you can enable. And really what this allows you to do is assess the quality of your knowledge articles. And when we talk about article quality index, we use an acronym of AQI. So if you've ever heard of AQI, it's article quality index. And really the value here is that we know it's pretty typical for you to have lots of different contributors to your knowledge base. And with that, you also want to ensure consistency. So this helps you maintain that consistency while also having multiple contributors. And so how this works is your knowledge administrator would create an AQI checklist. And essentially what that would be a set of true or false questions. And we see some example questions of what that could look like on the right. This is this is a sample AQI checklist that we deliver. And so again, these are true or false questions that you can set. And you can also adjust weightings to these specific true or false questions. And again, these are really assessing the overall quality and consistency of your article. So how this would work is your knowledge contributors would complete these questions to really assess, again, the quality of your articles. And there must be a passing score before that article can be submitted for approval. And once we get into the live instance overview, I'll show you how this can be set up and associated to a knowledge base that you may have at your organization. The next thing I want to talk about is how you can actually use our predictive intelligence or machine learning capabilities to drive knowledge demand insights based on your HR case data. So if you remember back to our slide that kind of had that bird's eye overview of the different features and the different pillars, in this process governance pillar, I said that this was one of my favorite capabilities. And the reason being is that this really helps you identify where you have possible gaps in your knowledge base. This is a very common question that we get from customers. How can I identify gaps and improve my knowledge? Knowledge demand insights really helps automate that. And so at a very high level, how this is working, if you are an HR service delivery professional or enterprise customer, you have two what we call solution definitions that are available to enable this solution. So solution definitions are essentially the records that you use for predictive intelligence capabilities. And we have two solution definitions that enable this. And at a very high level, how they work is they're looking at your HR case data. And for those HR cases, it's looking for similarities between your HR cases and your knowledge. And if there are any HR cases where a similar knowledge article can't be identified, it's clustering those into kind of a collection. So again, what we're looking at here, if we look at the screenshot on the top right, is our demand insights for HR cases dashboard. So what these are the clusters or collections of HR cases where you don't have similar knowledge identified. From that dashboard, you can click into a collection or a cluster, and you can see a list view. And so from there, you can do different things. You can click in and view, the specific information. You can generate a representative sample. And there's also a button or a UI action that allows you to report a knowledge gap. And so what happens when you click that is you see kind of a modal pop-up, which is the bottom screenshot. And what it's doing is it's allowing you to report a knowledge gap, and it's populating some of those frequently appearing words within that collection. So it's really nice because it's bringing to life, the themes that are, being surfaced in that collection or cluster of HR cases where you don't have similar knowledge. So then when you submit that, what's happening is, of course, that can go to your knowledge team, and they can identify how they actually need to address that gap that exists in your knowledge base. So again, this is a really great way to use your HR case data to drive your knowledge forward. And so if you're not already using this or aware of this, I highly recommend that you further look into this feature because, again, it's one of my favorites. Now I want to cover just a couple of things under that agent or author experience persona. And again, I've just picked one specific thing. There are a lot of things we could cover, but the thing I want to talk about under this bucket is our Microsoft Word add-in. So this is relatively new. This was released in our Paris family release. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to enable an add-in that lets you author, edit, and access articles in Word Online. And so as we all know, Word is, something that a lot of, employees use. All of us, I'm sure, use it on a daily basis. And it allows for flexibility in terms of the formatting. And most people are very familiar with the formatting options that exist in Word Online. And so this is an additive experience to the HTML article creation process that, again, allows your creators the ability to really create high quality formatted articles. And so how this works is once you configure this, the plugin activates a side panel in Word Online. And this is where your users can search for an article, they can add details to publish an article, edit an article, and follow essentially that entire publish workflow from draft all the way to publish. So we have some example screenshots on the right of what this looks like. And progressing forward, if we just zoom out a little bit, this is what it looks like specifically within Word Online. So once this is configured, the add-in for Word Online would show up in the Home tab, as we can see here in the screenshot. And then you can see another view of what that side panel specifically looks like. The next thing I want to show in Word Online. So this is, if you are viewing an article in the platform that already exists, this is what this looks like. So you actually have an edit in Word UI action or button that you can click. And what that'll again do is take you to Word Online to go ahead and edit that. All right. So now the next thing I want to talk about are design considerations. So like I mentioned before, we get a lot of questions from customers on some kind of common design decision points. And so I want to start providing some considerations for the audience to think through as you're making these design decisions for yourself, or even if you're a partner in partnership with your customers. So the first question that typically comes up in terms of design decision is, how do I determine the right number of knowledge bases for my organization? And what I would say here is that there's not a single answer that we can give. There's not a magic number that we can define that applies to all customers. But again, there are considerations that we can point you towards to help you decide what that right number is for you. So one of the first considerations here is this concept of findability. So you really want, of course, high findability. You want people to find what they need. And knowledge bases that are segregated by functional area or department can improve your findability. And so just to give a very simple example here, your IT agents will likely have different knowledge needs than your HR agents. And so that falls into that kind of consideration bucket of findability and whether that's kind of a consideration for your organization. Another large thing to consider is this concept of permissions. So we talked earlier about the flexibility in terms of security and targeting with knowledge articles, knowledge bases, and knowledge blocks. But sometimes, depending on your specific requirements, it can be easier to manage article permissions at that knowledge base level rather than at the specific article level. So again, we talked about the different levers that you have at each of those levels, but this is something to consider as you're defining your knowledge-based strategy. The other thing to consider here is approvals and requirements around that. So each knowledge base has an approval workflow, and we'll look at how that is set up at the knowledge base level in a couple of moments. And so oftentimes the number of knowledge bases that an organization may need is correlated to the number of knowledge approver teams that you have at your organization. So again, findability, permissions, and approval workflows are some of your big kind of considerations as you're thinking through how many knowledge bases you may need. Another common thing that comes up is categorization and taxonomy. So the thing to point out here is that there is no product limit to the number of categories that you can have or the number of taxonomy topics from a purely technical perspective in our platform. However, there are a couple of kind of considerations I want to share. So similar to what I shared for the concept of knowledge bases, there's not necessarily a perfect number of either categories or taxonomy topics for any organization. This answer actually depends from organization to organization, and it heavily depends on your scope of services and the content that you have. So when I say scope of services, this correlates back to the services that you're providing to your employees. And when I say content, this very directly applies to the number of knowledge articles that you have and the number of catalog items that you have. Another thing to point out is that categories and taxonomy topics do help drive organization, but there is such a thing as creating too many. So I like to say avoid creating so many that it does become difficult to maintain or navigate. And again, there's no perfect number that we can give. This heavily is dependent on your scope of services, but did want to call that out as a consideration. Another thing I want to talk about is kind of a general rule of thumb in terms of the hierarchy. So as we talked about before, when we were talking about categories and taxonomy, you can use parent-child relationships to create that hierarchy. And what we recommend here as a general rule of thumb is to not create a hierarchy of more than 3 levels deep. And this kind of feeds into the previous bucket of making sure that you're not becoming too complex with your categorization or taxonomy design. All right, now a couple of general tips. So again, this is a big topic. I could probably spend an entire day talking about general tips as it relates to knowledge management, but a couple of high-level things that I want to talk about today. So the first is really, we get a lot of questions from customers on the best way to improve your knowledge base. The answer here is the best way to improve your knowledge base is by looking at your closed cases. So it's best to identify what's not clear or what's missing and why that was a case in the first place. Why isn't that something that employees are able to self-help on? And so the nice thing about this is this very directly goes back to what we were talking about with knowledge demand insights. So that was that dashboard that I was showing you that's driven by machine learning or predictive intelligence that looks at your HR case data and looks for similarities with your knowledge. So this is, of course, a direct way to look for those knowledge gaps that may exist using your organization's HR case data. Another thing I want to talk about is a couple of things to consider about your knowledge articles. So first and foremost, you'll want to make sure that your knowledge articles are consumable and brief. And this is one of those things that when you see it written out on a slide, it may sound obvious and basic, but it's actually, it does require some attention and some thought. And so just some high level kind of points to consider here. When I say consumable and brief, think about, if you are an employee and you're, accessing a knowledge article on the portal, you're not going to want to read through, text heavy paragraphs and paragraphs of information. When we read content online, we tend to skim. We like things in bulleted format. And so it's really important to make sure, again, that that is consumable and easy for your employees or your agents to really read and get what they need out of it. Another thing to make sure of about your articles is that your articles actually answer questions. So I've heard a couple examples given here in the past of bringing this one to life. And one of my favorites is, let's say that you have an employee. Maybe they're in the Midwest like I am, it's getting cold out, and they are going into a physical work location and they want to bring a space heater. And they go to your portal and they try to find that answer to that question. You might have a workplace, safety policy that describes what they can and can't bring. But really, you want to make sure that you're answering that specific question for your employees. And again, making it as easy as possible for your employees to get answers. The other thing I want to talk about is making sure that your articles are actionable and give direction on process and next steps. So you never want an employee to visit a knowledge article and feel like they've reached a dead end. You always want to give them an action and give them oversight into the overall end-to-end process on the topic that they're reading about. Another thing under that articles bucket is to really align to a common voice and tone. And this again is one of those things that may sound obvious on a slide, but in terms of bringing this to practice, it's really important to think about. Like we talked about before, you'll likely have multiple people at your organization contributing to your knowledge. And one of the really great ways to drive this is actually by using that AQI checklist or article quality index checklist to really, again, align to a common voice and tone across your organization. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of general tips is making sure that you are using our platform to your advantage to really drive process and governance. So one of the things to really understand is that more is not always better when it comes to your knowledge base and the number of articles that you have. There is such a thing as having a cluttered knowledge base, and a cluttered knowledge base can make it even harder for people, so either employees or agents, to find exactly what they're looking for. And so one way to keep tabs on this is to continually review your view counts and your knowledge feedback and really establish guidelines for what continues to be published. Another thing I want to talk about here is the concept of our valid to field. So this is something that you can use in our platform to drive continual reviews and updates of your content. And once we go into an instance in a moment, I'll show you how you set this at the knowledge base level. Another thing to point out here in terms of process and governance is to consider establishing ownership groups to really share that knowledge management workload across several experts and improve your response times and feedback and updates. So we, of course, have kind of the concept of an author, but oftentimes, one piece of content may actually be owned by an entire group. And so this, again, is a way to really share that workload across several experts that sit at your organization. All right. So now that is it for our slide content for today. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to transition to my instance. So I'm going to swap my screen share and pull my instance up. And now we're going to bring some of this to life. So one moment while I get that situated. Okay, so where we're going to start with this is I am going to show you what this looks like to kind of look at a knowledge base. So just getting logged into my instance, one moment here. Reshare my screen. Okay. And so what I want to do, like I said, is show you what this looks like to look at the knowledge base. So I'm just going to search knowledge in my left filter navigation. And I have this saved as a favorite. So I'm going to go ahead and click into view the list view of the different knowledge bases that I have in my instance. And what we're seeing here are a couple of things. So we ship some out of the box demo data, and that includes some knowledge bases. So we see those, and we also see some test knowledge bases that I've created just in my own instance. So what I'm going to click through is this human resources general knowledge that is part of our demo data. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through some of the key fields and things for you to understand that are configured at the knowledge base level. So of course, as you would expect, you're prompted to specify a title for your knowledge base. That's this first field that we see. The next field that we see is article validity. So this very directly ties to that concept of the valid to field. And so if you leave this blank, that valid to field is going to default into the future of 2100. So it's very far out. But what you can do here is you can specify a number of days at this knowledge base level to enforce a calculation. And so you can enter, of course, an integer value of whatever makes sense for your organization. And again, this is inserted into number of days. Next, you're also able to associate an icon for your knowledge base. You have a couple of checkboxes that you can use to kind of disable certain things. So let's say you want to disable commenting for your knowledge base, suggesting, or category editing. These are things that you can use the checkboxes to control. You're also able to decide if you want to enable knowledge blocks at the knowledge base level. So this is checked here. Next, we have a checklist field. So this is where you can actually configure an article quality index checklist to be associated to your knowledge base. And so I won't click through the end-to-end process here, but we do have that sample article quality index that we deliver. And so I could associate that to this knowledge base if I desire, but I could also configure, again, one that's specific to my organization. Then you're prompted to give a description for your knowledge base. Looking over here to the second column, there's also an application. So this defaults to the application that you're in when you create your knowledge base. Then you have the ability to specify owners and managers. So an owner really has oversight over this knowledge base, and they're able to, assign additional managers. And managers really have additional capabilities. I won't walk through it all. I recommend checking out documentation to understand exactly what knowledge managers can do. But typically, they'd be able to do things like define category structures, configure which users can read and cannot contribute, move and pin articles. So there are a lot of activities that they can kind of contribute to. Next, we have the publish workflow and the retire workflow. So as I mentioned before, this falls under that process and governance bucket. And we do ship some out of the box, example workflows here. And for right now, at this knowledge base, I have this set to instant publish and instant retire. But this is where you would be able to associate workflows if you do require approvals to happen at your organization, perhaps before an article is published. Scrolling down, you also have the ability to set default knowledge field values. This is not something I'm able to edit. This exists as a knowledge base already, but if you were creating a new knowledge base, you would be able to set a default value for fields at this knowledge base level. Going down here quickly just to the related lists, you can see all of the different knowledge artifacts or articles that exist as a part of this knowledge base. You can set who can read and who can contribute. You can enable article templates. So I very quickly talked about that earlier, but again, this drives that consistency across your articles, and you can associate a template to make sure that you're prompting for specific values and fields. And just to give an example, I know one out of the box template that we ship is around kind of FAQs, and it prompts for a question and an answer. Next, you can see featured content. So you're able to kind of associate a keyword and feature that accordingly. So how this would work is, let's say every time someone searches the keyword of health and safety, this specific featured content knowledge article would appear in your featured content widget. And this is also where you maintain those knowledge categories. So it's kind of a quick preview of the knowledge base. Next, I want to give a quick preview of that content taxonomy that we talked about. So in the left filter navigation, I'm typing in content taxonomy, and I'm going to click into taxonomies here. And what we're seeing is first our out-of-the-box taxonomy that really serves as a blueprint that you can clone and modify as necessary. So I'm going to click into that quickly and just give kind of a quick tour of what that looks like. So as you can see, we have a taxonomy name. We can define the managers for this taxonomy and a description. Then we also see the child topics that are associated to this taxonomy. So these 3 topics that we see here, these are correlated to what you own as a ServiceNow customer. So if you're using HR service delivery, you would get HR. Same goes for IT, workplace, legal, and procurement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click into this topic of HR. This is one of our top kind of root topics. And I'm going to open the record and just show you some of the fields that exist at this level. So of course, we have the ability to kind of associate an order, provide a description, an icon, and a banner image. These all kind of correlate to those topic pages that I was talking about, and we'll look at that shortly in terms of what this specifically looks like. Then you see the ability to connect content, and you also see child topics. So again, this roots back to that hierarchy that I was talking about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click into one of these child topics of pay and time. So now what we've done is we've started with that parent topic of HR. We've gone into pay and time. So that is really that second layer of the hierarchy. And then as you can see, once we click into pay and time, we have 4 additional child topics of compensation and the other items that we see here. So compensation would really be that 3rd level of the taxonomy. So here you can see that parent-child relationship is associated. The parent to this topic of compensation is pay and time. We can see it's associated to that taxonomy of employee. And you're also able to see the fact that we have 17 different pieces of connected content as a part of this taxonomy. So we have various knowledge articles and catalog items that are surfaced here. And in a moment, what we'll do is we'll go to the portal and look at some of this. We'll look at a dynamic topic page so I can show you what the employee persona is really perceiving. But very quick, before we do that, one last thing I want to show you is I want to show you some knowledge properties. We have a lot of knowledge properties, which is really nice. It provides a lot of flexibility here. But I'm going to scroll down to some specific properties around actionable feedback. So we talked about this earlier in slide format, but I want to specifically draw your attention to the properties that control this. So the first property that we see here is asking if we want to create actionable feedback tasks when an article is flagged. We have that set to yes. Similarly, we have another property that's asking if we want to create actionable feedback tasks when an article is marked as not helpful. So we also have that set to yes. And so that directly correlates again to that helpful yes or no question that we saw when we were thinking about this from that employee persona. And we also have, this ability to essentially set a star rating threshold. And so what this is doing is it's saying anytime an employee rates an article as 2 stars or below, it's going to generate this actionable feedback task. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hop over to our portal view. We're going to look at a knowledge article, and we are going to rate it, and we'll show you what that process looks like. So of course, this is our new Employee Center Pro portal. I don't have time to give an entirely full tour of this portal today, but a couple of things to very specifically call your attention to that we reviewed in slide format. So this is that new mega menu header kind of navigation widget across the top. We also have that recommended for you widget, which is again surfacing those recommended articles and catalog items. And here are those popular topics that again are driven based off of that taxonomy and the popularity of the content that you have tagged to these topics. And what happens, of course, if you click in here, or if you navigate via this mega menu widget, you can click into a specific topic or child topic. And what that's doing is it's taking you to one of those automatically generated dynamic topic pages. So this is for the topic of compensation. This was just the topic that we were looking at a moment ago when we were in the platform view. And what I'll say at a very high level about this topic page is, again, reinforcing the fact that this is auto-generated based on the content that you have tagged. I'd also say that this is kind of configurable in terms of what you're seeing here. So right now we do see this browse compensation widget, but I have flexibility in terms of the icon that's appearing here or the banner that's appearing. We saw that earlier. We also have the ability to kind of tag quick links and videos here as well. I haven't done any of that configuration, so that's why we just see kind of browse compensation at this point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually click into this how to read your paycheck article. And as we can see, here are some of kind of the pieces of information that we have accessible to us. So we see the star rating. It actually only has a 2-star rating at the time. And if we scroll down, I want to show you again those feedback opportunities. So we have the ability to rate this article, mark it as helpful, yes or no, or again, add a comment. And what we're going to do today is I am going to give this a 2-star rating. And again, remember that we had that actionable feedback property set to that 2-star threshold. So it is going to be creating an actionable feedback task. And I see this pop-up modal thanking me for my feedback. And I'm also able to give a little bit more context. So I'm actually going to say, I think this article is unclear. And the reason I think it's unclear is it's hard for me, let's just say, to follow my paycheck and read what's here. So I'm going to type in a comment here. So we're saying this would be more clear with an image. I'm going to go ahead and submit that. So as we see, we kind of get this confirmation as the user that the feedback has been received. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop back to that fulfiller view. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go find that knowledge article where we just left feedback. And I'm going to show you that feedback task that was generated. So if I go in here to my published knowledge, here is that article that we just left feedback on, how to read your paycheck. So I'm going to click into that. And this is the knowledge article. So if I scroll down here to the bottom, we see feedback tasks. And so what we see here is a feedback task was actually generated. And so I'll click into that in a moment. And just at a high level, how that would work is if you have ownership groups associated, that would go to the owner or the manager of that ownership group. And if that's not set at your organization, that would actually go to the last person who revised that article. So I'm logged in as system administrator just to keep things simple today, but I, of course, I'm the last person who created and modified this article. So I'm going to click into this knowledge feedback task. And as you can see, I can kind of identify different information that's here. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, this is work in progress. I'm checking out the feedback that was just submitted by the user. I can go back and reference the article that's being, provided feedback on. I can see the reason. I can also see the description that the, user just provided as they were providing their feedback. And so let's say I click into the article, I review the feedback, and I do decide, okay, I'm going to take action. Let's say I'm actually going to, edit this article based on that feedback. So I'm going to click Edit Article. And I do have versioning enabled, so I need to check this article out to make any modifications. And what I'm going to do, again, that feedback was around, being able to really follow along with their paycheck. So let's say at my organization, paychecks look a little bit different based on the country that you're in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a block that has an image of a paycheck to really help those users understand what their paycheck looks like and how to read it. So to make things quicker, I know we're running low on time. What I've done is I've pre-configured a knowledge block. I'm going to insert that into my article. And so we now see this is just another tab that I navigated to that knowledge block was just inserted. And so I've added that. And in this real life scenario, what I would typically do is add multiple blocks to accommodate those different views of the paycheck and tailor that. But just to keep things simple for today, again, I've created one and I've added criteria to this to really only display to users who are in the US. So I've inserted that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and publish that. So now what I'm going to go back and do is go back to my feedback task. And I'm going to say that really what I have done here is I have, edited that article. So I'm going to say this is actually now resolved. I'm able to select a resolution code. So I actually just updated my article. So I'm going to select that as my resolution code. And then if I click into outcome, I can actually find the article edit that I just performed and associate that here. So this is that how to read your paycheck, version that I just published and updated. I'm also prompted to put in a resolution note. So added image. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now that's resolved. So now very quickly, I will go back to our portal and I'm going to come back here. And I'm going to go back to that topic page of compensation where we had that article. And as we can see, here is that new image that I just added as a knowledge block. So again, this is only going to display to users who are in the US because I've inserted that as a block and I've added that criteria of US. And I know I'm still in a system admin. I guess what I can do really quickly, let me impersonate somebody who is in the US just to show you that that is working. So Gail, let's impersonate Gail. I know she's in the US. And what I'm going to do is I'll click into Gail's profile and I'll show you all that she is in fact in the US. So yep, we see there she's in Georgia. So now we're in as Gail. Let's go back to that compensation page, click into how to read your paycheck. And there we go. Gail does see it. And very, very quickly, let's also impersonate somebody who's not in the US. There's somebody named Roxy that I'm going to impersonate who's not in the US. So there's Roxy. And I'll just show you her profile very quickly. There's Roxy. We actually see she's in Australia. So we go here. She also has that compensation page. She'll click into how to read your paycheck. And look, there we go. Roxy does not see that block that I just inserted, again, because I've added that criteria of US to that block that I inserted. So now what I want to do is I want to pivot back to some frequently asked questions. And in a moment, what I'll also do is I'll check with my Q&A experts who are on the line who have probably been busy answering all of your written questions to see if there are any themes that we should be discussing. But before we do that, I'm going to share my slides again. And I have just a couple of frequently asked questions that I wanted to cover because we do have a couple of minutes. So these may have already come up in written format in the chat. But again, one thing I want to reiterate is, how many knowledge bases should my organization have? We talked about this, but I want to talk about it again because it comes up a lot for us. Again, I want to reiterate that there isn't really a magic number. And again, this really depends from organization to organization. And again, those considerations are around findability, permissions, and approval workflows. The other thing I want to cover at a very high level is how does internationalization work for knowledge? So this is a big topic, and I think we're evaluating for one of our future Academy sessions, doing a deeper dive into internationalization and globalization. But at a high level, you can activate knowledge internationalization features and language plugins so that you can create language-specific articles. And the way that works, again, at a very high level is you can associate parent-child relationships for maintaining your translations. And then, of course, if you're an employee, you can then view and search in your own language. And we also do have some advanced features like machine learning translation, or not machine learning, just machine translation, where you can basically tap into a vendor to generate a machine translation of your article to make that as easy as possible. So again, that topic of internationalization and translations is a really big one. And we're again looking at that as a future Academy topic, but wanted to cover that at a very, very high level today. And I know we're just about right on time, but what I'll do with our next minute or so is check in with Loknath and others to see if we've gotten any major themes come in the chat that we should discuss live.
Yeah, listen, I think one repeat question that we have received is around implementing taxonomy on portals other than the employee portal. I think we have answered, but maybe because multiple customers have asked, so maybe we can take another.
Sure.
Attempt.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the taxonomy that I talked about today is specifically something that we released in tandem with Rome and our Employee Center portal. And if you're not already familiar with the concept of Employee Center, really what it is an enhanced and rebranded and repackaged version of our Employee Service Center. And so if you're familiar with that name, again, in Rome, we've relabeled to Employee Center and we've released a lot of new capabilities. And so all of those curated experiences capabilities and that out-of-the-box taxonomy really do work hand in hand with Employee Center or Employee Service Center. The other thing I would mention is that these portal technologies of Employee Service Center and Employee Center are all using the same tech stack. And so if you are an existing Employee Service Center, once you upgrade to Rome and kind of install the Employee Center updates with the store, you would have the capability to start incorporating that taxonomy. The other thing I would say about that taxonomy is that that is a really big topic. And actually, just last week, we had a dedicated Academy session in another community forum where we really dug deep into that taxonomy. And myself and a colleague showed how you actually clone the taxonomy and associate content. So what we can do after today's event is we will post out that recording link to this event page to make sure that if you haven't watched that, you have access to that as well. And I know that puts us right at time. So I want to be respectful. Thank you, everyone who was able to join live. We appreciate your attendance and thank you as always.